Hello and welcome to Heart Talk. Today we're here in the Diocese of Rockford, Illinois to talk to the shepherd here. His name is Bishop David J. Malloy. He's the 9th bishop in this diocese. Let's welcome him. Hello and welcome to Heart Talk. Today we have the shepherd of the Diocese of Rockford, Illinois. We're going to know more about him, and he will explain to us why he went on this journey to the priesthood and became a bishop. So we would like to introduce to you our guest for today, Bishop David Malloy. Your Excellency, thank you for joining us here on Heart Talk.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. You grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Tell us about your childhood and your family life growing up.
Well, we were 6 kids in an Irish Catholic family. We lived a block and a half from the church, the parish church, and attended the parish school. But what I think was particular for my family, both my parents were very strong in their faith, and we had a practice in the family that once you made your first communion in 2nd grade, you would go to Mass every day. My parents went to Mass every day. And so depending on what the schedule was of school, or if it was a free day, you could pick which Mass you were going to go to, but we went to Mass every day. And I think that was a great discipline. I think it was a great grace for us. And the other thing is that being only a block and a half from the parish, we could, especially in those days, kids could walk much more freely than perhaps now. So we were able to coordinate our schedules and walk down to Mass, and that had a lot to do with growing up. Going to Mass every day. The other thing is being here in the upper Midwest and being in Milwaukee, so the change of seasons was very important between the summertime and getting all your jackets on and your muffler and scarf and running down to, you had kind of this seasonal feel about going to Mass. But that was very important and something that was very significant for all of us.
So you had a very strong foundation spiritually with your parents.
And, they were excellent models of faith, and it was a joyous family at the same time. As happens in those cases, it was, you had demands and expectations, and I'm glad that we did. And my mother is still alive. My father passed 30 years ago. But that certainly was the foundation for the rest of life.
And that molded you into who you are today.
Well, I think in many ways, one of the things that I think back on is if you go to Mass that often, you begin to hear things like different phrases in the scriptural readings that are being read. And maybe you don't reflect on them as much at that moment, but they become a part of you. And I think going to Mass and receiving Holy Communion every day, and the other rule in the family was that you will go to monthly confession. And we were kind of on our responsibility to do that, and our parents would, as I remember it, periodically just check and make sure. But it's the kind of thing, it wasn't an imposition, it's just the sort of thing that you did.
It was
and
natural.
You took it on, and it became a part of the foundation and the formation. And I suppose in many ways it colors my own view of dealing with young people and dealing with families and dealing with the transmission of the faith. It can be done, and we have to be not only optimistic, but we have to be proactive. And parents have to take on the sense of passing on the faith, and not only the instruction of the faith, but that living of the faith, and particularly the prayer life, the sacramental life.
Now, as a priest, you basically worked in Muslim countries, Pakistan and Syria. Can you tell us about that?
Well, what you're talking about there is after I was ordained, I was asked to be a part of the Vatican's diplomatic service. I had completed my seminary studies in Rome, so I had a working or better knowledge of Italian, which made me at least something that they might consider for ask for a position like that. So I went into the diplomatic service and went back to Rome for more studies, completed that, and my first 4 years in the service of the diplomacy of the Holy See was in Pakistan. So yes, that is an Islamic country. And from there I went for a year in Syria, and obviously there too, an Islamic country and an Arabic and Arabic-speaking country. So, you began to see not only the perspective of our own faith, but some of the challenges in the world. Not only that rubbing and almost conflict at times that can happen between groups of people that hold different religious beliefs, and the need to be able to live together and find the way to live together, or the consequences when that doesn't happen. And periodically in Pakistan, during the years that I was there, you would see both the ability to get along and live together, and sometimes the ability not, and the consequences. I think of that a lot now in Syria. We're all aware of the tremendous tragedy, the refugee tragedy, the suffering of not only the Christians there, and it's tremendous suffering that in many ways we're not focused on as much as we should be as a church, as Americans, as simply human beings. But even members of the Islamic faith are suffering at the hands of the extremism and the terrorism that's gripping Syria. So I go back about 25 years to when it wasn't as aggressive and as visible as it is now. And yet there were moments, there were times when you saw that, and it gave also a perspective here in the United States, where we're going through a lot of pressure on the church and religious freedom. But to have seen the Christian community in other countries having to deal with more direct threats to their freedom and their religious freedom, and sometimes their courage, sometimes simply their resolve, their joy in standing up. It gives you a perspective of how it is that God works to strengthen us and make us able to address those questions.
How was Christian life at that time, back then?
It was a bit of a mix. There were moments when, especially when I was in Pakistan, that the Christians would suffer directly, sometimes even violently, from the discrimination. There were other times when they were able to worship freely and openly and have their celebrations, and have not only the liturgical celebrations, but even some of the outside, and we might say civic celebrations that the Christians would have. There were Christian villages in the midst of that Islamic society. There were times and moments when the Christians and the Muslims got along very well, just as families, just as normal people. And there were the other moments of clash and conflict. And so it was a constant effort to be looking at all of that. And part of the job in the diplomacy is to be communicating all of that back to the Holy See, to the Vatican, so that they have an understanding of what's happening here, and communicating from the Vatican to the local church and the faithful who are there, so that they're aware that they're a part of a universal church.
So the Christians there had their time to worship and practice their faith too. They were able to do that.
There were many times when Sunday Mass was scheduled, Sunday Mass, and plenty of them came. When I was there, at least one occasion, I flew up to the northern part of the country into the Hindu Kush Mountains for Christmas, because they didn't have anyone to say Mass. So they asked me if I could be available and go up. So I had to learn phonetically the Mass in Urdu, the local language. Basically, I had recordings of it and phonetically transcribed, so that I learned the Mass for them.
Yes.
And flew all the way up there. And the people who were the Christians up there maybe went to Mass twice a year, at Christmas and at Easter. There was no parish bulletin to put around. There was no flashing sign. They simply knew that at noon on Christmas Day, they came out of the hills and gathered for the Mass, because a priest they knew would be there somehow. And I was able to do that. And it was a very moving experience at the time, to see these people who are living holding on to their faith as best they can without a great deal of support, certainly without daily and weekly Mass, and yet here they would come because this is what you do as a Christian in order to practice your faith.
And God gave them the grace to actually be out there and say, yes, we're Christians, so we want to worship God.
And they were very aware of being Christians. This is the thing that was very remarkable because in many cases they would be, some were educated, but many were simply the workers who really had, in that society, not a great deal of education, but even so, they knew
in their hearts
what they were.
Yes.
And they were ready to sacrifice greatly for that.
Wow. And you also had a stint with the United Nations. Can you share about your, I think, 3 or 4 years with the United Nations?
Yeah, I was 3 years in the United Nations, and that was during the time when they were having these international conferences. So the first one that I went to was the Women's Conference in Beijing in that would have been 1995. I went to the Conference on Settlements in Istanbul, and I concluded my service with the international conference that negotiated the International Criminal Court. That was the last phase of that was held in Rome. So there was a lot of different issues that were coming about, and the church was always trying to put its perspective into questions like the role and the nature of women, settlements, which would have to do with the poor, which would have to do with migrants and refugees and the ability to give them settlements and housing and that sort of thing. And then, of course, something like the International Criminal Court and trying to work with the countries to agree on what's going to be the set of crimes that would be applicable to this court, who would be answerable to this court, who would be on the court as the judges. The Holy See as an international entity, as a state in its own, had a right and an interest in all of these questions. So for several years, I was working on those questions as well.
Well, that's actually great. Now, you also held your last position outside the United States was the prefecture of the papal household. What is the role and what are the duties that you did and fond memories when you did that position?
Well, the prefecture of the papal household is essentially, it's one of the offices in the Vatican that is very close to the Holy Father because it's basically his scheduling office. And so, at least under Pope John Paul, certainly he would make some private arrangements for somebody coming, but in general, all of those audiences that you see, and the public audiences, those audiences like recently President Trump was received by the President.
Yes.
This is the office that does all of the arrangements ahead of time for those kinds of meetings and gatherings and visits, so that the Pope has a schedule, information, and so on and so forth. And then there's a very specific protocol that gets followed, and that gets worked out, and particularly world leaders would send their representatives ahead of time so that they know exactly what the steps are going to be. But it also had to do, the year that I was there, with the great Jubilee year of 2000, where people from all over the world came for the Jubilee of 2,000 years
Yes.
of the birth of Christ and our faith. So the Holy Father, Pope John Paul, had a huge number of gatherings, and Jubilee for this, Jubilee for that, Jubilee for cooks, Jubilee for youth, Jubilee for teachers, Jubilee for police and fire. It was across the board and constant. So my job was basically to be one of the assistants lower down in that office, because you will see, if you know who he is, the prefect is the one who's often sitting next to the Pope during the meetings. But somebody's got to be back in the office doing all of the
coordinating,
doing all of the behind-the-scenes work. And so they asked me if I would be willing to give time to that, and I was very happy to do that. The prefect at the time was an American that I knew and was able to work with and assist. So for the 2.5 years that I did that, basically it was behind-the-scenes work of the letters, the organizing. We ended up with a computerization of the office and a distribution. People would get their tickets for such and such an event, had to get the right ticket to the right person. We handled over 5 million people that year. So there certainly was, there was plenty to do.
and the schedule was always hectic.
Well, because if you remember those days with the Holy Father, with Pope John Paul, even though It was the beginning of that era where he became a little less able to move and had the Parkinson's that was beginning, and yet still he was such a trooper with all of his activities. He loved being with the people. He was so committed to the Jubilee year and to the manner that that could express the faith and convey it. So it was very interesting being not one of those that was around the Pope, but still close enough to watch a lot of the comings and goings and the back scenes sorts of things. It was a very interesting couple of years.
Now, on hindsight, you worked under the Pope, Pope John Paul II, and he became a saint. How does that feel?
You know, I think of that when I do my confirmations. And the young people take their saints to be, for their confirmation, to be confirmed in the name of the saint. And there are two in particular that always kind of get my attention. One is when the saint, the young person comes up typically, and it's John Paul, and the other one is Mother Teresa. And the reason is that I had the opportunity to meet both of them. Pope John Paul, in that office, also in the diplomatic service, you had a chance just periodically to not have a lot of time with him, but I did have lunch with him one time and otherwise just have an opportunity to have access to him. But to say to yourself, I had access to someone who is now a recognized and a canonized saint, and someone that you should be praying to and asking his help and his intercession, especially as a bishop. Similarly with Mother Teresa, when I was in Pakistan, she came to visit her convents there. And by chance, I was on retreat during the time of her visit, and she came for Mass at the retreat house one morning, and I was told by the sisters running the retreat house that the Cardinal of Karachi and myself and Mother Teresa would be having breakfast after the Mass. So you have but the point is to look back and say, these saints, they're real saints. They're as much a saint as St. Peter, St. Paul, St. Joan of Arc, and I actually had a chance in this world to meet them.
Yes.
You think about that quite a bit, and you think about the holiness that you felt as a part of those meetings.
I'm sure it was a great privilege for you.
I've never met anyone who filled a room like Pope John Paul when he would walk in the room. And I've often asked myself, was it just because he was the Pope of my time, and if anybody walking into that room with the white cassock on, and but I think there was something just very particular about the holiness of Pope John Paul. You could certainly feel it with Mother Teresa. Many people have commented that you felt that sense of holiness and dedication to Christ and the Church. And it's remarkable then every time you do a confirmation and their name comes up and you're drawn back to those moments.
Goes back to the times that you were there in Rome helping out. So also, you've been a bishop in the Rockford Diocese for the past 5 years already. Do you have a special mission that you would want to see come to fruition during your tenure?
I think the special mission is simply, what does Christ want? And obviously, for all of us in the United States right now, the factors that we see going on that present the challenges kind of define the mission for us and how to make Christ known and loved. We think of the secularism. We think of the difficulties of family, the difficulties of marriages and marriages staying together, and the reticence of our young people to enter into marriage, the declining birth rates, and the meaning of the fact that not only are marriages declining, but the fruit of marriage itself is declining, and all of this being a part of God's plan. But there's many, many factors for that. There's the secularization, there's questions of the economy, there's matters of our media and its role in our society that makes it more difficult for young people and for older people to continue to think in a manner that follows Christ. So how would you define what the mission is? It's what Christ puts in front of you. And right now, I think we see all of these challenges all over the place, but those are the challenges of the moment. Other bishops in other times, be they missionary, be they in places where the faith was strong, the faith was weak, they all had their challenges. And the mission, in a sense, was defined for them by what was given to them.
And you were actually on YouTube last year when you were with Father Ramke and Father Mano. You did the spoof of the carpool karaoke, and it went viral. I saw it, and it was fun. It was beautiful to see the priest and a bishop just being themselves, just interacting. How does that feel now that a lot of youth, the teenagers, recognize you and say, that's the bishop who was on YouTube?
Well, that's beginning to fade a little bit now. That was a little bit more right after the YouTube, as you know, the attention span. They've moved on to other YouTubes and videos and things. But the thing about that was one of the first concepts for it that Father Mano and others came up with was, he said that for him in his vocation, one of the things that most interested him and got him interested in the priesthood instead of what he had been following along was he saw joyful priests. And he said this is something that he has continued to want to present to the world and to especially young men, so that others would see that this is not a life to be afraid of. This is not a life that's somehow going to imprison you in your priestly promises, but it is every bit as joyful as you could imagine. So I think this was simply an expression of that, yes. And Father Ramke is very much in that same sort of mode as our vocations director. They asked the bishop if he would be willing to come along, but you know, if you view that YouTube, the two guys in the front are the guys who carry it, and the bishop is in the back. I was very happy to be there because one of the other things we wanted to do. That video was first played for our youth summit, our annual gathering of our young people, which is very popular and very well attended. But it was the introduction to the moment when the bishop comes out and talks a little bit. So one of the things that they're trying to do was, again, it's a part of the faith, humanize the bishop, make him to be a human part of the message of Christ and what it means to be Catholic, rather than some kind of figure that's an abstraction. And those were, I think, some of the guiding principles that were behind it. It was kind of fun. And you know, you made the point that everyone was being themselves. I think that's one of the things that I was most pleased with, and I think really worked for. We took one take.
That was one take?
There was no prior conversation about any of that. We simply did what we did. So
it just flowed.
Everybody that's in there and what they're doing is simply everybody being themselves. And I think, you know, being those two priests especially, being themselves and yet able to convey that sense of joy, that sense of Christ, that sense of faith.
That's right.
It's an awful lot better than some sort of scripted kind of thing. And I think that's one of the reasons it was successful.
It appealed to the masses, not just the teens, the youth. It appealed to everybody all over the world. It's over 500,000 now. So look at that. With that message, there is still that seriousness of asking, appealing for vocations, for the ones that would be discerning. And yet, it was light, it was fun, and the message came across like that. So people were drawn to it, and I'm sure more and more will be watching that. Now, you also have your weekday, like 60-second reflection on TV. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, every morning, just before the 7 o'clock hour, there's just a simple reflection on the readings of the day. And it's simply an effort. Certainly, we're motivated by our Catholic faith, but I know I hear from a lot of people around here who are not Catholic, but who still tell me that they watch it very regularly, if not every day, because it gives them simply a thought for the day that comes from Christ, comes from God, comes from the Scriptures, something to start, something that they might not have otherwise thought about, that just helps them orient their day. I did talk to someone who says, I know that if your talk is already over, the kids are late for the school bus, so maybe there are some other uses for it. But by and large, the number of people who comment on it and periodically or even more regularly watch it, it becomes a real outreach. And I think the other thing that it does is it once again humanizes a little bit the figure of the bishop, and I think it also makes the Catholic Church present in a very regular way in the community, in the media.
That's right.
That very sense of presence itself helps to underscore and give a certain sense of credibility to the message whether it be at that moment, whether it be the wider message of the church. The church is here, and that in itself is a good thing.
You wrote in The Observer, the Catholic newspaper of the Rockford Diocese, that no age and time, Jesus is always the answer. People actually have that misconception, like every generation would say, oh, we know better. We know the world better and clearly because we can see it. We perceive it. But for the ones that say Jesus is obsolete because he existed like 2,000 years ago, what can you tell people that today that he is alive and he's reaching out to everyone?
The faith has always been something that is passed on by witnessing. It began the moment that Mary Magdalene ran back and said, I saw him outside of the tomb in the garden. And the apostles then received the Holy Spirit and immediately went out and spoke in all of the different languages, witnessing. They went on to give their lives, the churches were founded and so on. But in each case, the transmission has been of witness. It has not been of photographs. It has not been of what's so dear to us in our age, the scientific proof. We don't pretend that there's a scientific proof for this because there couldn't be. This is the other world, the world that awaits us, eternal life crashing in upon us here, helping us to break out of the chains of sin that we've had. So that's, I think, the point that we have to be so conscious of in our modern society, which for several hundred years has been so fixated on science and so fixated, therefore, on the study of what it is we can see and feel and hear and approach with the senses. But if this is something that's outside of the senses that we're called to, that we have to make that explanation to the world. One of the ways that I explain it when I'm talking to the young people that I'm going to catechize is to say, we've all been through this before if we think about it. We all spent 9 months in a certain sense, another world in where we became very happy and very warm and very comfortable. And we might have had little slight inclinations that there was a world out there. Perhaps vaguely we could hear our mother's voice and so on, but we really didn't want to change things. We wanted to stay where we were, but we had to break through into the world that was awaiting us. And that's the world around us now. Well, on that same sort of imagery, are we not in that moment here where we're waiting for our own breakthrough into the world of eternal life that Christ has told us about, that all of those witnesses have told us about, that we now become that link in the chain of witnessing that will be the strong link for those who come after us if we do our job and if we're faithful. So that conflicts with the scientific mentality. And that becomes, you asked what's the challenge, what's the program? That becomes a strong part of the challenge and the program for the church in our day. Find the language, find the images.
That's right.
Find that connection with happiness that is lacking in a world that relies on science and human knowledge and more tries to push God aside. People aren't being made happier by that. And we have to kind of keep pointing that out and help people to come to grips with that and then say, well, then what's the answer? And there he is, Jesus Christ waiting for us.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for your time and effort, how we learned more about you, not just the carpool karaoke, but your ministry and how you have that servant's heart to reach out to people. Well, especially in your diocese, being the shepherd of your flock here.
Christ is the answer, Christ is the challenge, and that's what the job's all about.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you have good news, we expect you to want to share it. Salvation in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who for love of us and for our salvation came down from heaven. Salvation in his name, and he is the only Savior, is what we are on earth for. Therefore, all those who spread the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ, we should encourage them. I can speak, but how many people can I reach alone? But the media, the television people, the radio, the newspapers, and all those who use the computer and its derivatives in various ways to spread the gospel. We must thank them. We must encourage them. We must work with them so that they can continue to spread the good news. There's so much news that is not so wonderful in the world, but there is also news that is wonderful on the gospel of Jesus Christ. We encourage them and beg God to bless them, especially the Shalom World TV. God bless you.
Shalom World, God's own channel.